What's up everyone, it's Delete, and today we are back with how to build rockets. Now in this video I'm going to be covering how to get to every planet in the new update system. We're going to be going through Silero, Sergea, Titus, Eurodose, and Volcos in order from easiest planet to get to hardest planet to get to based on the amount of delta V you need to get to that planet. Here's what we're going to be taking a look at. We're going to be looking at what transfer angle you need to be between Drew, the planet you're launching from, and your target planet, and how much delta V you need to pack on your rocket to actually be able to make the transfer to those planets. I'm only going to be doing the main planets for this episode. That means I'm not going to be doing transfer information for Andrew's Comet or any of the moons of the major planets. You'll have to get that on your own, or maybe I'll cover that in a future video. Let's start with Silero. Silero, you'll need 1,819 meters per second of delta V to get from low Drew orbit into a home and transfer orbit to Silero. You'll need another 1,372 meters per second of delta V to do a capture burn at Silero and actually capture yourself into an orbit around Silero. Now, one of the advantages of Silero is it has an atmosphere, which means you can use atmosphere braking or aero braking, where you use the drag from passing close to the planet and hitting its atmosphere to slow you down, and that can save you a lot of delta V, but it's a little risky because if you overshoot or undershoot, you can fly out of the system or crash into the ground. Now, as far as the planetary alignment, you'll need a transfer angle of 47.5 degrees between Drew and Silero in their orbits around Juno. That means if you were to put a protractor up to your screen and measure the angle between the two planets, you would get 47.5 degrees. Now, it's important to remember that transfer angle has nothing to do with your spacecraft. Transfer angle only refers to the alignment between the planets. It has nothing to do with the angle that your spacecraft is relative to the planet it's orbiting or the sun that the planet is orbiting. All of these burns are going to be conducted at what is called the midnight point, where you are exactly opposite the sun around the planet that you're launching from. As we can see in this diagram, Silero is ahead of Drew by 47.5 degrees. Drew is lagging behind the planet, but because Drew is in a shorter orbit, or a tighter orbit around Juno than Silero is, it's actually making revolutions faster, and so we need to start from behind Silero to make a transfer burn, and as we transfer between the orbits, we will catch up with and then intersect Silero at a specific point opposite of us where we are now. Moving on to Sergea, you'll need 2,091 meters per second of delta V to put your craft on a home and transfer orbit to the planet. You'll need another 2,164 meters per second to capture your craft around that planet. Sergea, like Silero, has an atmosphere, which means you can use aero braking to help cut down some of the cost for delta V for your mission. Because Sergea is inside the orbit of Drew, you will have to do the opposite of what you were doing for Silero, where Silero is outside the orbit and you need to be behind Silero in your orbit to catch up to it. Sergea is inside your orbit, so you need to be ahead of Sergea to slow down to its orbit. So your home and transfer orbit to Sergea, you'll start 103 degrees ahead of the orbital path of Sergea with your transfer angle between Drew and Juno, and then you will burn backwards towards Sergea to drop your orbit down to its orbit. So that means instead of burning on the opposite side of Drew from the sun, you're going to be burning on the same side as the sun, and you want to burn parallel to the orbital path of Drew around Juno. Next up is Titus, the large gas giant. To get to Titus, you will need 3,959 meters per second to insert your craft on a home and transfer orbit. You will need another 3,434 meters per second to slow down and get captured within Titus's gravity. Titus, being a gas giant, of course has a massive atmosphere, so aero braking is very possible around Titus, but it can be a little tricky because the atmosphere gets thick very quickly, and if you overshoot, you'll burn up in its atmosphere. Titus, having an orbit greater than Drew's, will be ahead of Drew when you transfer to it by 97 degrees. So you will want to be behind Titus by 97 degrees in your orbit, or roughly 1/4 of your orbital angle behind. And again, like Silero, because it is an outer planet, you will be launching or starting your burn at the midnight position around Drew. Next up is Eurodose, the ringed gas giant. Now Eurodose is the farthest planet in the system and it is very difficult to get to. To push your orbit all the way out to Eurodose's orbit, you'll need 5,200 meters per second of delta V to insert your spacecraft on a Hohmann transfer orbit. This is a lot of delta V, but it does not require as much delta V to get captured by Eurodose because of how slow you're traveling when you actually get out to its orbit. You only need 2,129 meters per second of delta V to actually perform a capture burn. And Eurodose, like Titus, has an atmosphere, so you can do aerobraking to cut down on mission costs. The transfer orbit between Juno and Eurodose is 111 degrees, meaning Juno needs to be 111 degrees behind Eurodose in its orbit. And last but not least is Volco, the hardest planet in the new system to get to. Volco, because of how close it is to the Sun and how small it is, has no atmosphere and is tidally locked with the Sun. And because it is so close to the Sun, requires a ton of delta V to get down to its orbit and slow down enough that you actually can be captured. To put yourself on a Hohmann transfer orbit around Volco, you'll need 3,933 meters per second of delta V. And to get captured by Volco, you will need 5,847 meters per second of delta V to slow down and enter its orbit. Because Volco is tidally locked and it's so small, there is no atmosphere, which means all of that change in velocity has to be provided by the fuel that you put on your spacecraft. This is why Volco is by far the hardest planet to get to. There are no ways to cut down on fuel costs with aerobraking. You have to burn the delta V to get into orbit. Now, there are a couple of different tricks to getting down there, like gravity assists, that I'll be covering in a different video. But if you're just looking to do a simple Hohmann transfer to another planet, it is going to cost over 8,000 meters per second of delta V in your final stage just to get to the planet. As far as the transfer angle goes, you only need to be 28.4 degrees behind Volco to get to it. Now, I say behind Volco because Volco's orbit is so fast that it will actually orbit the Sun a whole time and a little bit extra before you get down to its orbit. Sergea, on the other hand, is close enough to Drew's orbit that you have to launch ahead of Sergea, whereas Volco, you actually have to launch behind it and it will lap you around the Sun before you get captured. It's very tricky to pull off because of these extra laps around the Sun. If you guys like this video, please like and subscribe and share this video with people you know who play Simple Rockets too and could use a little help with their interplanetary transfers. In the next video, I'm going to be covering mission planning and how to figure out how much delta V you need to put on a spacecraft to get to where you want to go. If you have any suggestions for future videos or things you'd like to see me do on the channel, please leave a comment below. I love talking to you guys in the comments section and you always have a lot of interesting stuff to say. Thanks again for sticking around, and as always, I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.